As stated at the outset, the Homo sapiens is a culture building migratory species. Right from his appearance on the earth's surface, throughout the Paleolithic and Mesolithic periods, man migrated to kill beasts. In the Neolithic period, he migrated to search for lands which may be brought under cultivation, and during the historic periods, he sailed to have trade relations with the neighboring countries and to conquer the new lands. In the medieval period, he migrated in search of new resources to establish his colonies and to avoid persecution. While in the modern and contemporary periods, man migrating either to improve his economic status or to at a place where he feels socially and culturally more and politically more independent. The causes of migration, as discussed at the outset, are numerous, and so the consequences. The scholars of population geography have done a lot of practical research and tried to establish certain laws of migration. After going through this module, you will be able to understand some of the important laws of migration, understand Lee's model of migration, and understand Zielinski's model of migration. So, some of the important laws of migration have been discussed here as: the first scholar to formulate laws of migration was E.G. Revenstein, who based his generalizations on empirical studies of population movement in Britain, the United States, and some of the countries of Northwest Europe. He observed the migration data between 1885 and 1889 and arrived at certain very important conclusions which may be taken as the laws of migration. Subsequently, other leading scholars like Lee corroborated his findings and added some new laws of migration. The laws of migration advocated by Revenstein are as under: first one, the majority of migrants go only a short distance, which he called as distance decay law. This law seems to have been operational at least since the medieval times and is still operative today. With the advent of modern transportation, the average distance travelled by migrants may have increased, but relatively short moves are still the most common. For example, the first major concentrations of the American blacks, that is Negroes, population in northern cities were in Baltimore, Washington and Philadelphia, all of which are relatively close to the source areas of migrants who left the South in large numbers after 1910. There is a tendency that most of the migrants move short distances, whereas few go long distances. This tendency is known as distance decay. This expression applies to most of the human activities. In fact, there is a decline in the amount of some phenomena with increasing distance from a focal place. In other words, many human activities and features tend to cluster near accessible places, so their frequency, volume or value usually declines with distance from the point of attraction. This tendency applies to the land values around a market. Population densities ranging an urban center, number of migrants to a place of attraction and numerous other phenomena that are affected by spatial interaction. As an example, consider the number of migrants to city X who came from districts A to G. When the amounts of migration are plotted on a vertical axis and the corresponding distances are displayed on the horizontal axis, the graphed trend indicates that migration declines, that is decays, as distances increases. Coming to second point, migration proceeds step by step. Revenstein's second law of migration is that the inhabitants of the country, that is rural area, immediately surrounding a town of a rapid growth flock into it. The gaps thus left in rural population are filled up by migrants from more remote district, that is rural areas, until the attractive, or we call the gravitation force of one of our rapidly growing cities makes its influence felt step by step to the most remote corner of the region. Such a series of moves was an important feature of migration to the American frontier in the 19th century, when farmers who wanted to move on to a new land would often sell out to later migrants. On a different scale, a series of step by step residential shifts is usually generated in urban areas today, when a family moves into a newly built house and thus vacates an older house, which is then reoccupied by another family, which leaves another residential gap, and so on. Coming to third one, migrants going long distances generally go by preference to one of the great centers of commerce or industry. This tendency of moving towards the great centers of commerce and industry has been operative since medieval times, when London attracted population from all parts of England. The pull of large cities is apparent in the developing countries. The industrial and commercial centers of Tokyo, Mumbai, Kolkata, Delhi, Karachi, Lagos, Sao Paulo, New York, Manila, Jakarta, Seoul, Shanghai, Mexico, Rio de Janeiro, Jakarta, Bangkok, Tehran, Cairo, Dhaka and Nairobi, Hyderabad, Bangalore, Ahmedabad, Kanpur and Pune. The effect of a large place on the size of the migration field is expressed by a gravity model. This mathematical model states that the number of migrants to a place is directly related to the population size of that place, but inversely related to the migratory distance. Coming to fourth law, each current of migration produces a counter current of lesser strength. This law of migration seems to be universal and applicable in almost all the developed and developing countries. Even in the extreme case of slave trade during the 15th to 19th centuries, produced a tiny counterflow back to Africa of people who in one way or another were able to regain their freedom and to return to their homes. Migrants who choose to move long distances to new places often move back. For example, of the 13 million migrants to the United States from 1900 to 1914, an estimated 4 million returned to Europe during the same period. In recent years, the proportion of immigrants from the United States has increased relative to the number of immigrants into the country, with the largest numbers returning to Mexico, Germany, Canada and the United Kingdom. Coming to the next law, the natives of towns are less migratory than those of rural areas. This observation was related to a stage of economic development in Europe in the 19th century, when rural to urban migration was predominant. In most of the developed and developing countries today, movement is still mainly from rural to urban places. Most of the developed countries have large urban majorities and relatively small rural populations. Therefore, most migration is inter-urban or intra-urban, that is within a city. In these developed countries, there is an increasing trend of outflow from urban centers to rural areas. This migration is associated with the decentralization of industrial jobs and the willingness of commuters, that is daily passengers, to travel long distances to their urban places of work. Coming to the sixth law, females migrate more frequently than males within the country of birth, but males frequently venture beyond. So, this law of migration was related partly to a stage of economic development and partly to its particular cultural context. Since women had few employment opportunities in rural areas, they tended to migrate to cities. At present, the gender of the majority of migrants depends on cultural conditions as well as on economic and employment opportunities. In India, for example, many more males migrate from rural areas to the cities than do females. During the British period, that is Calcutta and Bombay were the main centers of commerce, trade and industries and attracted the people from distant places of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. Nowadays, all the million cities of India, particularly Mumbai, Delhi, Kolkata, Chennai, Hyderabad, Ahmedabad, etc., are attracting male migrants from all corners of the country. Migration between rural Indian villages, however, is commonly made by females because brides traditionally move at the time of marriage to the village of bridegrooms. Man is more attractive in international migration than women. In the Gulf countries and in Saudi Arabia, there are large number of immigrants from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Philippines and South Korea, and over 85% of them are male workers. Coming to seventh law, most migrants are adults. Families rarely migrate out of their country of birth. This law contains two observations. The observation concerning adult is universal and indisputable. In voluntary migrations, the majority of the people are adults. The second part of the law is more problematic. It is certainly true that families find it more difficult to move than unmarried adults, but owing to the cultural, religious and political factors, families migrated from one country to another country. Many refugees migrated from India to Pakistan and Pakistan to India in 1947 and from Bangladesh to India in 1971. Similarly, families migrated from Ireland to Canada, from Uganda to Kenya, to UK and to USA, from Somalia and Ethiopia to Yemen, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and from Palestine, that is West Bank of Jordan and Gaza Strip, to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Coming to the eighth law, large towns grow more by migration than by natural increase. It is universally accepted that large cities grow faster because of immigrants and population influx. For example, over 60% of the total population of Delhi, Mumbai and Kolkata belongs to people who came in these cities from the distant part of the country in search of employment and got settled. Most of the large towns and cities in the developing countries today are growing very rapidly by the immigration of people from the rural areas. In addition to job opportunities, which have always attracted migrants to large cities, today's major cities of the developing countries offer more medical and educational facilities and social entertainment. Coming to the ninth law, the main causes of migration are economic. This law is also universally accepted. It has been argued that international migrants tend to be influenced more by conditions in the area of destination than by the pressure of population at home. The movement of Indian laborers to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries is mainly because of unemployment in rural India and better job opportunities in the Southwestern Asian countries. It is, however, difficult to verify that the major reason for migration is economic. Human motivation, decisions and behavior are so complex that it is very difficult to compare the relative importance of economic factors with other considerations. For example, moving at the time of marriage is not regarded as primarily an economic move in those societies having love marriages. Also, many persons with wealth or large pensions enjoy the flexibility of choosing their residence in areas having an attractive physical and or social environment. Most of the above discussed laws of migration advocated by Ravenshtein are universally accepted. There are, however, many questions which Ravenshtein did not address. For example, the non-economic, cultural, social, political, psychological and religious causes of migration have not been examined by him. Since the time of Ravenshtein, several other theories and generalizations have been propounded by other scholars to explain the process of migration. The famous sociologist Everett Lee propounded another theory of migration in 1965. He generalized following 4 factors which influence the decision of an immigrant: factors operating in the area of origin, factors operating at the destination, factors that act as intervening obstacles, and personal factors that are specific to individual. The potential migrant is influenced by positive and negative factors associated with both the place of origin and the possible destination. Lee suggested that the potential migrant weighs the known and expected advantages and disadvantages of the destination in comparison with the situation at the place of origin. For a move to result, the attractions of the destination must be great enough to outweigh the advantages of staying and to overcome any intervening obstacles such as distance, cost of relocation, and the disruption of established patterns of life. Personal factors also affect the evaluation process. For example, a family with children in school, college, or a couple without children may not consider the quality of public schools, colleges, and universities at either the point of origin or destination, but these educational institutions may be an important factor in the balance sheet of a family with children who are in the education stage. Similarly, attachment to place and proximity to family and friends may prevent a potential migrant from moving even when other factors such as promotion opportunities seem attractive. In 1971, 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗍, the famous expert of population and migration, also propounded a theory about migration. His theory of migration is known as the mobility transition model. 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗍 proposed that changes in migration behavior have been paralleled by the stages of demographic transition model. Similarity between the two models is not surprising because demographic conditions and migratory decisions are both related to changes involved with the urbanization, industrialization, and modernization process. 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗍's generalization about the migration have been shown in figure. These figures show the trends in volume of migration through the 5 stages of the demographic transition model at 4 different scales: 1 international, 2 regional, 3 rural to urban, and 4 urban to urban including intra-urban. In addition, 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗍 prepared graphs to show the interrelationships between the migration and circulation, that is short term, generally repetitive movements over the 5 stages. The mobility transition, as with the demographic transition model, is primarily a depiction of stages experienced by modernized societies. Nevertheless, it may provide a basis for anticipating some future migration patterns in countries undergoing economic and demographic change. In the first stage of mobility transition, when population growth was negligible because of high death rates cancelled out high birth rates, little migration occurred at any scale. In India in 1931, for example, only 10% of the population lived outside the district of their birth. Life was localized, information on other places was in short supply, and most people lived and died in the locality of their birth. Some population movement did take place, but relative to later stages of the demographic transition model, migration was less common. Circulation was mostly daily trips to fields and occasionally journeys to markets and festivals. So, this transition model explains different graphs or the scales of migration in different stages. The second stage, when population increased rapidly because the death rate dropped while the birth rate remained high, was a time of great migration. Mounting population pressure on the land, better transport system and a widening sphere of exploration and trade and bringing knowledge of other places gave rise in the past to increased population movements at all scales. People migrated from one country to another, from settled areas to new frontiers, from rural areas to growing cities and from towns to cities. Immigration from Europe and 19th century domestic migration to American frontiers illustrate these conditions. 𝗧𝗠𝗏sky's third stage is transitional matching, the third stage of demographic transition model, when the birth rate began to fall toward the death rate and the population growth rates declined. International migration lessened and agricultural frontiers closed, as in the United States by 1930. But at the same time, rural to urban migrations and movements within and between cities became more important. With the shift to secondary and tertiary occupations, people increased their circulation by commuting to jobs and travelling to obtain special services, for example, medical and educational and so on. By the fourth and fifth stages, when low birth and death rates brought little population growth to the new developed society, migration was predominantly interurban or intra-urban. Some international movements occurred, particularly of skilled and unskilled workers from the less to the more developed countries, but progressively stricter immigration laws limited the number of people who could cross international boundaries legally. The rural to urban movement virtually ceased because the percentage of farming population and hence potential movers was very low. As would be expected, circulation increased as the societies modernized. The development of the private automobile greatly widened the radius of daily travel. When circulation increased, migration became less imperative. For example, by commuting an hour each way every day, there is an area exceeding 20,000 square kilometers in which to find a job. This increased access to jobs reduces the need to migrate. It may be summarized that as the economic interdependence increases and standard of living rises, more and more people out migrate from the places of their births and countries.